Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very important event, which of course is what we're all here about. And I just want to say before introducing our principal speaker this morning, just for those who are not really familiar with the Climate Group, how we work and also why I'm involved. So my name is Mike Rann. I'm the global and UK chair of the Climate Group. I'm a recovering politician. For many years in Australia, I was in Parliament, a minister, and for 10 years was the Premier, or in US terms, the Governor of a state before I went into diplomacy. But I was also Australia's first climate minister. And we decided back in 2004 that we were going to be an exemplar in Australia and internationally on decarbonisation. And I'm really pleased that following that initiative, that just a couple of days ago I've learned that from a standing start of zero renewable energy, we're now at 75%, and by 2027 we'll be at 100% with a 60% reduction in carbon emissions from 2005. And the reason I mention that is that a lot of it came out of the Climate Group, the whole group of subnational leaders. We have 200 that are involved, 200 state governments on every continent in the world involved with the Climate Group, and we swapped ideas. We shared solutions that worked. We worked together on legislation. And we also have 600 of the world's biggest companies that are all committed to net zero. So, to get to the right destination safely, every plane has to have two wings, and we have a government wing and we also have a business wing, and influenced by science, we've basically been tracking forward, and we need to go faster. I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Kapnick, who's the Chief Scientist of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And it's really interesting because I've been researching Sarah this morning. She has an extraordinary CV. We know that you need government and you need business, you need science and you need economics to actually achieve the objectives of net zero. And so all of those things have basically come together through Sarah. I'm sure I won't embarrass her by telling you that she's got a PhD from Princeton and UCL, degrees from UCL and Princeton, and is a climate scientist who's an expert on water, oceans and atmosphere. But she's also worked in business. She's worked for JP Morgan, she's worked for a number of other Wall Street institutions, she's been involved in a startup, and she's also been involved with a carbon registry. So if you look at all of the things that we need in terms of seriously tackling this issue, we could not have a better speaker today than Sarah. So she's an international expert on climate prediction, on extreme storms, water security, climate economics, and climate risk. And I know I'm interested in some of the things that I'm sure she'll talk about when it comes to water. We've had in Australia, where I'm from, not only the most appalling bushfires, but we've had a series of what were once called 1 in 100 year events happening over the last 10 years, 1 or 2 years apart, including having an area of water in one flood exactly the same size as France. So will you please welcome Sarah? We look forward to her presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm so excited to be here to talk about the issues of where we are scientifically. Next slide, please. So to step back, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where I come from, our mission is to advance our understanding and forecasting of climate, of weather, of oceans and coasts. We are dedicated also to sharing that knowledge for others. We need to make the science, but then make it actionable so others can use it. We also, as NOAA with the National Marine Fisheries Service, we are also in charge of ensuring that we have healthy oceans and ecosystems and are managing fisheries towards sustainable fisheries. Our organization is structured into 6 line offices that they specialize in producing those weather forecasting, coastal and marine research, all of the fisheries management, satellite data and operational satellites that both point towards Earth for weather on Earth, but they also point towards the sun for space weather. We also have cross-agency research and a full R&D arm, which is where I spent most of my career, as well as we have fleet operations. One of the uniformed services of the United States government, the NOAA Corps, sits within NOAA, and these are the service people that fly into hurricanes and atmospheric rivers, and they go into pollution zones to capture all the data that we need to make our predictions. They also man our ships around the world, mapping the seafloor, exploring the deep ocean. They provide us with this wealth of information that we need to be able to produce the science, to make it actionable, to then act upon it. Next slide, please. So at NOAA, for pictures of visualizing this, we monitor the Earth systems both with stations on the ground, gliders in the ocean, as well as from space with the satellites. This includes tracking tons of different environmental parameters in the ocean, the atmosphere, and on land, from greenhouse gases, so the picture on the top left, greenhouse gases steadily going up every single year, to also to ocean temperatures. We take all this information and then we model the Earth system to be able to predict future conditions. Our observational network gives us the understanding of where we are today, but then that recombines with our models to be able to predict hours from now, days, months, years, decades from now, what the world is going to look like. Next slide, please. So where are we today? NOAA is committed to investigating climate trends by measuring the atmospheric and oceanic greenhouse gases and using all this information to inform climate mitigation strategies. So from these charts on the left, top left, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, they are all steadily rising, and actually they've been increasing in some of their rates of rise for methane. And this contributes to our global temperature increases that we have seen since the pre-industrial era, since 1850. On average, the globe has increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the entire globe, over multi-decade average since pre-industrial. We reached 1.5 degrees of warming over the last 12 months in the last year and change. So we have also reached, in 2023, the hottest year on record that we have. And 10 of the warmest years on record have happened in the last 10 years. So next slide. So not only do we monitor what has been happening, but we also predict into the future. And this is a new product that we've started putting out because we reached 1.5 degrees Celsius. We now have a website which we update every single month with our seasonal forecast. So on the left bar, you have the last couple months of where the temperatures have been. And then our seasonal forecast puts out the global temperatures going forward. So we were in an El Nino. It's usually the hottest year on record, peaking after an El Nino, and then we're actually moving into a La Nina, which is cooling off the planet. So you see that we reached above 1.5 degrees Celsius for a couple months there. And now our average predictions, that red line on the right, it's below 1.5, but there are still some scenarios where we can hit that warmth again in the coming months. And so we are not only monitoring what's happened to date, but we have really good knowledge of what is to come. Next slide. So global temperatures, I think, are really hard to absorb and understand. What does that mean for me and the place where I live? So on a location basis, we on a monthly basis and on an annual basis put out where are the extreme events happening around the world through the global climate report that we put out. We are seeing extreme events happening on every single continent and in the ocean. We are able to see and observe increases in heat waves, increases in the amount of water falling from the sky that leads to flooding, sea ice loss, and ice cap loss. The overlap and compounding nature of these hazards and the changes in statistics that we're seeing poses significant challenges for communities and complicates our response and recovery efforts and creates a substantial resource allocation issue at the national and international level. Next slide. I'm not going to talk about the floods in Australia, but I am going to talk about coral reefs. This global temperature heat that we saw in the atmosphere of being the warmest year on record, we also saw ocean temperatures at the warmest on record. Coral reefs are impacted by this. They are a vital ecosystem, but they also have global economic and ecological value estimated around $10 trillion annually, and they face significant threats from climate change. So we are undergoing right now the fourth major global bleaching event on record. The first one was in 1998, 8% of the world's corals died. 29 in 2018, 14% of the corals died. This one we are seeing is the most widespread and the largest ever. We are currently at a bleaching event of over 70% of corals' death in bleaching under this heat wave that we are experiencing. Our NOAA's Coral Reef Watch actually monitors and predicts the extent and severity, and we do this worldwide. And the temperature change that we've seen and the severity of it, we actually changed, you can see the color bars, we actually added 3 new levels because we had never observed these levels of severity of bleaching ever before. So our alert level 5 is now near complete mortality of a coral reef. We're actually seeing near complete mortality of reefs due to this bleaching event right now. And unfortunately, we expect to see these with the next El Nino in the next 5 to 7 years that occurs. We will expect to see large bleaching events again. So climate models are predicting this stress for coral reefs into the future and only getting worse. Next slide. On a financial standpoint, NOAA also produces the $1 billion disaster program. We actually monitor $1 billion disasters across the United States. Since 1980, the number of these events, but also the total amount of the cost of these events have grown. It's due to changes in the statistics of both the events and the severity, but it's also due to social vulnerability. So our vulnerabilities mixed with the increasing likelihood of events leaves us financially exposed. To bend this curve, we need to bend the curve on climate events, but we also need to bend the curve on vulnerability of society. Next slide. I also wanted to comment, since the title is Global Boiling, on heat. Heat poses a significant risk. It is also known as the silent killer. Here in the United States, more deaths occurred to heat than any other of the disasters. We've seen recently over 600 deaths in individual events in parts of Arizona due to heat waves that we've experienced. To combat this, NOAA's been actively involved in mapping urban heat islands in the United States and internationally, including cities like Rio de Janeiro and Freetown, where we actually go out with citizen volunteers with sensors, and they go out into their cities and we collect all the information so we can map out what the heat map looks like at a very local scale. And that is then used to build the resilience plans to try to reduce that heating during heat events. In the US, we've also created a new heat risk tool, heat.gov, where you can actually go and you can find all the forecasts, short-term forecasts for hours, for days, for weeks, for even months, for the seasons. But it also has all the case studies of what cities and communities are doing to combat the heat exposure that they're experiencing. The National Integrated Heat Health Information System, it's not just NOAA that has developed this out. We've also partnered with CDC, with Veteran Affairs, with HUD, with all the other agencies to be able to make sure that, because we know heat affects everyone in society and it affects the most vulnerable in different ways, we need to have plans for how to deal with it so we can reduce that exposure, reduce the lives lost, but also reduce the economic impacts that we are experiencing from it. All of these efforts are designed to help communities develop and refine effective heat response plans and ensure they're better equipped to handle extreme heat events. Next slide. I also wanted to comment that we are creating a ton of products around greenhouse gases. We monitor greenhouse gases with our satellites. We also have canisters around the US and around the world that monitor greenhouse gases, and then we recombine this information into various products. One of them in the US is the grapes product. This system captures monthly emission across various economic sectors and regions, and it's used really so for local and state governments can monitor their greenhouse gases, understand what is happening. We're also doing private partnerships with United Airlines to be able to capture more information, to be able to know all the greenhouse gases across the country. So next slide, to wrap up, it's not just a government problem and government solutions to creating the science. We need to commercialize these technologies, we need to scale them, and we need to partner with the private sector on doing so. We've been doing that across ocean technologies and carbon technologies and various other technologies, and it is critical for the scaling up of all of this work. Thank you.
Dr. Kapnick, for sharing those fascinating insights. And I guess all of us who attend these functions and events not only have concerns and fears, but we also have hopes and aspirations. But we've got to make those decisions on the basis of science, and it's terrific to see the work that you're doing, including internationally. And that's, of course, what you've said sets the scene for our next panel. For me, for the next panel, I'm very pleased to introduce to you three excellent panelists. So please join me in welcoming to the stage from Pernod Ricard. I'd like to introduce Maria Pia De Caro, Executive Vice President of Integrated Operations and SNR, and benvenuti. And next, I'd like to introduce Eugenia Carbo, Chief Heat Officer, Freetown from Sierra Leone. And I have to say I'm really interested because we're doing some things like this in Australia, so very interested to hear your insights. And finally, let's welcome Ariel Daronje, Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. You're most welcome. So I think I'm okay I'm wired. So the presentation by Dr. Kapnick has really established that global warming isn't just occurring, it's accelerating at an unprecedented pace. And the impacts of this will be felt by business, by communities and governments alike. So my question to each of you is as follows. Reflecting on your own experiences and expertise in diverse locations and working in different communities and nations, what is the impact that you're seeing in the day-to-day of your roles? For years we've had the warnings of the scientists, and I think people are now experiencing those warnings coming true, but it'd be very interesting to hear how it impacts on what you're doing. So perhaps, Maria Pia, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to start with a quote that actually my best friend offered to me today for this panel. And the quote is that sensibility and priorities change over the course of a generation. In my case, I'm an engineer. I've always had an immense passion for operations and for personal and process safety. So I've always championed that over the years. And now that I am at Pernod Ricard, that is a leading company for premium spirits, over 240 brands, distributed in 160 markets, 20,000 people, 90 factories, very much dependent on nature, because all our products come from grapes and wheat and barley and rye and agave. I have really evolved my sensitivity and my sensibility to the priorities of the environment. And at Pernod Ricard, we have decided to make an important shift, putting sustainability directly within the responsibility of operations, because we felt that operations influences the creation of the products, the making of the products, the distribution of the products, and therefore, who better than a solitary engineer like I am to drive some of this transformation.
Excellent, thank you. And Ariel, perhaps turn to you next, in terms of your completely different perspective.
I don't know if I'd say it's completely different perspective. So first off, Iglanite, hello, in my language, which is Dene Sotlene. And I do want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Lenape peoples that were pushed out of this territory through occupation. And the landscapes the Lenape people occupied for thousands of years were forever changed by settler colonialism. And within the work that I do with Indigenous climate action, we had elders that when we went to communities to talk to them about the day-to-day impacts of climate change, what they were facing, and talking to them about climate change, when we started this journey, they were like, what do you mean by climate change? And when we tried to contextualize through both scientific, stats, facts, talking about changing climates, changes on the landscapes, and the way we're experiencing things, we had time and time again elders that would sit in silence and listen to conversations and then come forward with one of the most profound statements that has become one of the hashtags of the global indigenous movement on climate change. Colonialism causes climate change. For us, the climate changed during first contact. We were ripped from our territories and our landscapes were turned into extractive resources to be used to drive economies that have gotten us into the condition where we are right now. And so the day-to-day experiences of the communities, indigenous communities, not just in North America, but globally, is that we're not just dealing with the changes of the climate and the rising temperatures, which are completely altering our capacities to maintain our cultural lifeways and connections with the ecosystems that we have lived with and in relationship with for millennia. But we are also dealing with ongoing colonialism, with the ongoing extractivism, degradation to our water systems, our ecosystems, as well as our traditional food systems and economic systems. And for me, I come from an Arctic community. We are Arctic Zone A. So the day-to-day realities for me is that we have seen how the rising temperatures has led to the fact that we no longer have an ice road for 4 to 6 months. We have an ice road for maybe 2 months of the year. And we are a remote flying community that has relied on this ice road for the transportation of goods and services. So this is completely disrupting our economic structures in our communities. We are seeing disruption for our ability to bring in construction materials and advance our sort of infrastructure in our communities. Additionally, with the rising temperatures, we're seeing the fact that the migratory patterns of keystone species that have been pivotal to our survival as far as subsidizing the high cost of food are disappearing. And that is an exacerbation to the already disappearance of those species because of extractivism in the region. We are also seeing migratory birds are disappearing. We are also seeing traditional medicines and plants are disappearing, becoming contaminated. This is the lived reality of my community, but my community is just one of over 500 million indigenous peoples across the globe. And the conditions that we experience are like the canary in the coal mine to what the global community will experience with the loss of sustainable food systems, the loss of local economies, and the loss of our capacities to have reliable transportation if we do not do what is absolutely necessary to combat the climate crisis, bring global temperatures down, bring emissions down, and reevaluate how our economic systems, our governance systems has led us to where we are. When you started this, you said, we've seen how this is affecting business, communities, and government. But as Indigenous nations, we are businesses, we have business groups, we are frontline communities, and we are sovereign governments. And we are striving to participate in these systems that were imposed on us to ensure that we change things for the better as sovereign nations, as equals within these structures, so that we can advance a future that isn't the erasure of our landscapes and who we are as Indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much. And what you've just said is so true in Australia, where, and I'm very ashamed to say that in the last 4 hours, the Australian government has approved 4 new coal mines or extended their life for 30 to 40 years. And a year ago, to great shame, in my view, voted in a referendum against giving a voice to the First Nations people of Australia. So
it's the same thing where I come from. I come from a zone where they are extracting the largest, it's called bitumen, or very, very crude oil. It's called tar sands or oil sands, bitumen, and this is one of the worst bottom-of-the-barrel oil industries on the planet, and it's becoming one of the largest oil and gas infrastructures on the planet because of the amount of water and energy. They're using natural gas to extract a dirty crude oil to deliver to international markets. And we are seeing approvals of projects that have life cycles of 50 to 100 years today.
madness.
Absolute madness.
Thank you, Ariel. And finally, Eugenia, perhaps give us a perspective from Freetown.
Thank you so much. So as we all know, climate change is really a major problem that cities and countries all around the world faces today. And for Freetown, we are extremely exposed to extreme levels of climate vulnerability, which has resulted to heat, extreme heat and floods and landslides. But on the heat side, you know, we usually say that heat is a silent killer, but then the impact we see all around us, which is really very evident. And the rate at which temperature are rising is unprecedented. And this is what we're seeing all around the world, in Europe, in Asia, and also in Africa. Several reports have been talking about, specifically the IPCC reports, have been highlighting the growing risk of extreme heat. The science is also there. NOAA has been working with different cities, mapping out the urban heat island. And for Freetown, the report shows that the level of temperature rise and humidity across communities are rising at a very, very rapid pace. And the major problem with this is that it affects people differently. It depends on where you are, where you live and how you live, and the economic power for you to adapt. So people who are most vulnerable are extremely and badly affected. So for me, I see urgency. And I really do think that we should move at a space that to address this, that matches the urgency of the crisis that we have. Because it's not going to stop. We just saw the presentation, recognizing that we are lagging behind in terms of limiting global temperature to 1.5. Last year was reported as one of the warmest in history. This year, the same thing. And how long can we wait? I think we need to take action.
Great, thank you very much. Well, maybe go to some individual questions now, and I particularly want to explore some of the things that you've just mentioned. So Eugenia is the first Chief Heat Officer in Africa. I understand that's correct. Your role seems to have been created as a direct response to rising global temperatures. With a rapidly growing urban population and rising average temperatures, the population of Freetown really is on the, one of the frontiers again of the changing planet. I'm really interested because I come from a very hot country, even before climate change, and one of the things we did to cool the city of Adelaide, which gets incredible temperatures in summer, was to plant 3 million trees through the city, not just to clean, but also to cool the city. And we involved communities in the process, elderly people, young people, multicultural groups, faith groups. Perhaps if you could just, tell us about how Freetown came to be the exemplar, how you became the front runner, pioneer, to create the role of Chief Heat Officer, and what sort of impacts that you have to deal with your working day, and what do you see as a sort of a plan forward?
So I'll say that there was a call to action on heat, on extreme heat, because even though the evidence were there, even though reports were talking about it, but yet the issue wasn't given any importance. And so there was a call by the Ashrock Resilient Center, which brought to life the establishments of the CHOs in different cities. And my city answered to that call because of what we were experiencing, but also because of the data that shows that temperatures across Freetown are rising. And this was absolutely true because when we conducted the Urban Heat Island mapping with NOAA, it was definitely a matter of urgency. And also the trend analysis that we also did also established the fact that over the last 4 years, the average maximum temperature of Freetown increased by 4 degrees Celsius. So from 2021 to 2024, from a baseline of 29 degrees to 33 degrees of prolonged and extreme heat. And when you think about the situation compared to other cities, you might say, oh, that's minimal. But for a city like mine, that's really very extreme. A city where the level of green space is very, very low. We have a city of 1.2 million, 35% of a city's population live in informal settlement. These are densely populated and densely built areas where the living conditions and also access to essential services such as water and electricity is lacking. Most of the houses are built from corrugated iron sheets. So the impact on the lives of people living in informal settlements who cannot afford to buy ACs or fan is really extreme. We also have a lot of people who are outdoor workers. 70% of the population also work in the informal settlement, in the informal sector. And you have a lot of women, majority of them are also women. And these women work in the markets, and most of the markets are outdoor markets. They are open markets without no shade. And so these women suffer from health issues, they suffer from economic losses because not only their bodies are exposed, but also the products that they're selling are also exposed and get damaged by the heat. We also have a lot of elderly population who spend most of their time indoors in houses that are not well ventilated or lack electricity. So it's really a major challenge for us. Even myself, working every day outside, hearing about how people are suffering, to have a good rest at the moment in Freetown is now a luxury for people who can afford to buy ACs and fans. For those who cannot afford, it's a nightmare. And the impact on your health, on your body, and productivity is really, really extreme.
Thank you. Maria Pia, I'd like to direct, now to perhaps shift on to business. Pernod Ricard is, as you've mentioned, a huge global business, employing lots of people, complex supply chains that depend on reliable crop yields to produce your products. And maybe if you could, with weather patterns likely to become more erratic in the face of rapidly rising temperatures, what is the impact that you're seeing on your operations right now, and how is your company looking to future-proof its operations in the face of such uncertainty?
Thank you. And first I want to offer a big thanks to Jen and Ariel for how you are making the reality and the urgency of its time really come to life. Because indeed my perspective is more from the point of view of the business, but we actually observe the same things from a different angle. So as I was saying, Pernod Ricard is a company that was founded 50 years ago by a French entrepreneur that believed that we are here to unlock the magic of human connections. So in a way, it's how do you offer these experiences through products that are made from nature, with nature, back to people. Now, we calculated how many crops we need every year. It's about 3 million tons of crops to just create those moments of conviviality and joy, or even to mourn, or to we actually connect as humans in many ways that we can count. Now, the frequency and the intensity of the natural events is putting these ecosystems under huge pressure. And if you think about some of the products that we enjoy, like champagne, you can only make champagne in a specific region in France. You can only make cognac in a specific region as well. And therefore, with climate change creating these extreme events, damaging crops, creating a broader spread of sickness that affects the crops, it is really putting all of this under risk. Recently, we have done a study to assess how big is this risk across our global footprint, and we have actually identified risks in different areas. One is what are the crops that need special care, and therefore we have activated several programs around regenerative agriculture to restore the soil, improve biodiversity, improve the utilization of water to make sure that we don't compete water for crops and water for human consumption, etc. So we have been mapping this and activating a number of projects globally. We have also been seeing where natural resources are available. If we need to expand business-wise, how can we actually select locations that are best, that are not, again, competing with other uses? And for the existing operations, how can we actually protect them from floods or from natural events that come our way? Now, we were discussing yesterday in another panel around how do we build trust? How do we educate ourselves? How do we create the insights for ourselves as a company? So we have several hundred thousands of hectares of crops that we run with partners. We have also our own crops. How do we develop trust in regenerative agriculture practices so that the very farmers or the very partners that develop those adopt them? Yesterday I was making a silly reflection. I live opposite a farm, and those farmers use very traditional techniques. At the same time, in the business, we are doing advanced analytics. We are using AI to collect data, to identify the better way of protecting the ecosystem and indirectly protecting the business. And I was thinking, how can we make truly sustainability commonplace to make sure that we can have a sustainable and harmonious development between the population, the community in which we operate, giving back as much as we get from those communities in terms of water and nature preservation.
Thank you, Maria. Now, Ariel, just in terms of ICA's role, you work with Indigenous people from throughout North America, and I think you told an incredibly powerful story before about the impact of the ice and the ice bridge. Maybe, and I think it's interesting that ICA believes, as do First Nations people in Australia, that Indigenous people's knowledge systems are going to be a crucial tool in developing solutions in terms of dealing to solve the climate crisis. So maybe if you could just perhaps flesh out other stories from around North America about how the climate crisis is impacting on people's lives.
I think that the impacts of climate change are so vast for Indigenous communities, and a lot of it has to do with a lot of the same things that you actually just talked about. Water quantity, water quality, which is impacted by rising temperatures, because as you have multiple interests in water systems, not just as water to be utilized, but water systems as forms of cleaning things. So, you know, we're seeing sort of wastewater management systems utilizing river systems, which are being evaporated into the air by rising temperatures. So we're seeing impacts to water quantity, water quality. What this does to Indigenous people's lives and livelihoods throughout all of North America, the Great Lakes, evaporation from rising temperatures is exponentially high, and every year is becoming worse, which is leading to higher levels of certain types of chemical compounds which are landing in the sediment, and we're dealing with like more contamination because of this. So water quantity, But as the quantity reduces, the quality of those river systems decreases, which impacts traditional food systems, whether those are fish and aquatic life, or whether those are large keystone species like moose, caribou, bison, deer, so on and so forth, which are all traditional food sources. And these are critical food sources. These are not recreational food sources for a lot of Indigenous peoples. And this is by design. A lot of Indigenous communities live in economic deserts, and so they rely on traditional food sources to subsidize the cost of living. And so these food sources are essential for their actual everyday survival. There's a story in my community where one year a woman's freezer, she didn't know, she was out actually on the trap line trapping, and her freezer died. And when she came home, all the stocks that she had put in her freezer had gone bad. And that was one of the worst years for her family because they did not have enough money to buy food from the grocery store, and they didn't have the reserves of their stores in their freezers. And this is because in isolated rural communities, the cost of food for transportation and importation of food is exponentially high, which is why we rely still to this day on a lot of traditional food sources. So when we talk about how Indigenous knowledge is actively, effectively impacting climate solutions, I'm also going to tell a story that has to do with water. In my community, when they were developing what's called the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, which was a plan to look at the Lower Athabasca watershed region and how we would manage all of the competing interests for the water systems. They wanted to look at what was going to be necessary for all sectors, business, communities, municipalities, and First Nations to have clean, accessible water quantity and quality in the region. They got their best biologists, scientists, engineers to study this region for years. And they came forward to our community with something called the ecological baseline water flow for the Lower Athabasca River system. And they presented it to our community. And I don't know the numbers off. I can't remember the actual numbers. We'll just make something up. They said, okay, the baseline ecological flow necessary to sustain everyone is 200 meters per second. And they said, are you happy with this, to our communities? An elder in my community and a knowledge keeper is like, I don't know what 200 meters per second means. Like, what does that tangibly mean? We don't know. And so my community said, okay, let's try to make this tangible. What does this tactically mean to you? So they got some water scientists to come out, and they said it would mean that the river would be this deep. And they showed them, like, the river would be this deep at this flow rate. And they said, good? And they said, let's think about this. And then a traditional hunter said, well, yeah, we can get to all of our major points for hunting, fishing, trapping, traveling, to all the major points, absolutely at that flow rate. But what happens when I put close to a 1-ton moose in my boat? I can't traverse that at that water depth. It won't work. My boat will bottom out. And I will no longer be able to hunt. And so what Alberta did is they worked with our community to create what's called the Aboriginal Extreme Water Flow Rate, which was almost double the flow rate of what they used as the ecological base flow rate. This is how Indigenous knowledge in years of millennia, and not looking at the environment as an externality to be studied, but as something that we live and work with every day, drives how Indigenous knowledge has a critical role in how we look at managing our ecosystems and advancing solutions to the climate crisis that don't see nature as something to be exploited and used, but something that we need to be working with every single day. Indigenous knowledge continues to challenge traditional methodologies of Western Europe empirical science and data and bring forward knowledge that was gained through our scientific methodologies of observation over millennia and transference of that knowledge through oral teachings and testimony and lived experiences on the land. We absolutely must be looking at how we can merge these two worlds together. Otherwise, we are going to miss critical metric points to actually finding real solutions to maintain crops for businesses, to maintain systems so that we can have commerce and keep our communities safe. And this is why when we talk about solutions, it cannot be based on one system dominating another. It has to be a collective effort together.
Great. Thank you. Excellent. Eugenia, I'd like to come back to you for the next question. So your role is very people-focused, obviously, as you work to adapt Freetown's infrastructure to cope with rising temperatures, and you talked about people living in corrugated iron homes and so on. So do you think that, are you seeing a movement around Africa for more people to be appointed to roles like yours? Is there now a movement towards that in other parts of Africa and appointing their own chief heat officers? And do you think that how is the government at the various levels, both city and state, region, national governments, responding to the sorts of things that you're doing?
So I'll say that at a time like this, it is really very important to have someone who is dedicated and focused in driving efforts to build resilience and to help support communities adapt to extreme heat. And so the role of the chief heat officers is very, 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 very critical. Since I was appointed 3 years ago, I have led several interventions in my city, from mapping the urban heat islands to working with communities and women in my city to install shade covers in markets to protect women who are extremely exposed and vulnerable to heat risk. We have been doing campaigns every year to raise the awareness and to increase the knowledge on how to prevent yourself and to reduce the impact of extreme heat in the lives of residents in Freetown. We've also been working a lot on nature-based solution and leveraging on the resources that we have. Because again, it's one thing to want to do something, but it's also a major challenge when you do not have the resources. But the reason why, for me, I see nature playing a major role in all of this is because the resources are accessible and they are available. And making use of the resources that you have is really very important. And trees play that role in our society. So we've been working a lot to increase the level of vegetation cover across our city. We've been working on a program which we call Freetown the Tree Town. And the goal is to plant 5 million trees by the end of 2030. We have, at the moment, planted over 1,500,000 trees across different land use typologies. In the coastal areas, we're planting mangroves, and in the communities, we're planting terrestrial trees, and we're using economic and fruit trees, and also trees that provide huge canopy cover to help to increase shading within the community. But it's more beyond the planting. It's about ensuring that there is a sustainable system and that we are building a model that will enable us to scale. And we are working together with communities to do that, because beyond the planting is also about the growth and the sustainability of the trees, and also the incentives. Because one of the major challenges we also face is the problem that we're having with the production of charcoal. And people are into cutting down trees and producing charcoal because that's the source of livelihood they know. And if we have to provide alternatives, we also need to ensure that the models that we are developing are sustainable and can provide incentives for the community. So within the model that we have developed, we are providing incentives to communities to take care and grow the trees. And so communities are incentivized. And by doing so, we've seen the survival rate of the trees that we have planted increase to 82% from a baseline of 52%. And we are also monitoring the trees because we know that data is very important, but we also recognize the fact that there are opportunities for building a natural capital by leveraging on the carbon market. So we have our mobile application, which we have been using to track the trees. So each of the trees that we're planting have a unique ID code. And so you can see where all of the trees that have been planted sitting at the comfort of your house, or even here, where all of the trees are located, the age of the trees, the steward, the person who is responsible for planting and growing the trees. And so we have been able to create over 3,000 jobs by doing so. And we are looking forward to scale. And most importantly, it's also very important to ensure that as we work together and as we move forward, we need to ensure that we have plans that are guiding our implementation. And so I'm very proud to say that today we now have the first ever EAT action plan for the city of Freetown, which is a blueprint for other African cities which they can leverage on to promote heat resilience in their city.
Thank you very much. Look, that's terrific and a really positive note as we sort of start to close down. I guess just finally, just briefly from each panelist, just what message would you most like to leave today, and perhaps also mention whether governments are listening? And yeah, basically that. Ariel first.
We are never going to reduce the rising temperatures if we don't stop the expansion of fossil fuel industries and high-emitting industries, which are not just violating our capacities to meet our climate commitments, but they're violating environmental protection, they're violating human rights, and they're violating the survival of Indigenous communities. We have to phase out of fossil fuels now.
Great. Eugenia.
So I also will need to continue to support regional government because they are at the front line of climate change, and so we need to give them the support. But also we need to ensure that we increase access to climate finance and to ensure that the distribution of those resources are reach down to those that are the most vulnerable and most in need. And the process needs to be very transparent and equitable.
Great. Maria, Bia?
I would say, ending with the theme of these days in New York, it is time to measure, bringing together the best of our knowledge, the Western methodology, the indigenous methodology. We need to measure because we are what we measure. If we measure, and humanity has proven it over and over again, once we decide to do something, if we understand the metrics, we get it done. The second thing is that it's time to act. And I think we have a moral, ethical responsibility for the communities, for the business, for society at large of acting. It's imperative that we act now. And lastly, it's time to collaborate. It's not the moment to discuss black and white. It's the moment to bring all the shades of color together to make it possible and to make it fast.
Thank you. I mean, absolutely terrific contributions from Sarah and our panelists. And I think that, that often the focus is on national governments. The annual COP, we've seen how the G7 and the G20 very quickly acted to save the world's banks. Mm-hmm. But there's all the celebrations of D-Day recently about how people got together, a generation. We're not seeing the same. We make incremental steps forward. There's the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting coming up, 56 leaders next month, G20 in Brazil. but often it's at local level and at state and regional levels which act decisively in the absence of national leadership. But I want to say terrific work here in the United States with your inflation reduction legislation. I mean, that's been transformational. Thank you, everybody. Great session, and all power to you.